Thanks so much for tuning in. I'm Rubin of Vineyard Time on Martha's Vineyard, and today I want to take a little time to talk about the Rubin Douglas brand. Rubin Douglas Timepieces is the brand I founded when I was 16 years old in high school. It was the first watch brand that I created, and I wanted to give a little bit of background about the history and how I created it. When I first entered high school at the Martha's Vineyard Public Charter School, I had hated school. And the charter school really changed all that because their mission and their whole purpose was to incorporate your interests into your curriculum. It allowed me to combine my passions into my everyday learning. And for me, I really wanted to start a company when I was in high school, and I was always passionate about collecting watches. I had grown up with watches, and so many of the watches that I loved, I couldn't afford as a kid. So the idea of creating a watch, creating what I wanted, the piece that I couldn't afford, really appealed as the brand concept for my first company. So I set out with this idea that I wanted to create a watch. And in 2003 and 2004, when I was first doing this, there wasn't the same availability of resources either through Kickstarter or through the internet to give you the same ability to become a micro brand that there is today. At the time, it was a very close-knit, tight industry, the watch market, and the idea of creating a watch within it was very daunting. I think the biggest reason and way that I was able to create a watch brand was that I was naive enough to think I could do it. And I was naive enough and interested enough and passionate enough that when I reached out to people to help me, a lot of them said, well, I don't really know if you'll be able to do it, but you're really interested in it. Okay, I'll help you. And I got the opportunity to work with some incredible people. And slowly, both through the school and through myself, I was partnered with different mentors to help me with the different parts of creating a watch company. I got partnered with an individual to help me write a business plan for the watch brand and a marketing plan. I got partnered with an individual to help me create the design of the case and learn about the leathers and the straps and the production. And through each one of these processes, we came closer to creating a brand. So I started by sketching in a sketchbook. And I sketched sketch after sketch and book after book before I found a design that I felt was interesting and distinctive and represented me. I didn't just want another watch that felt like an alternative to your Rolex or an alternative to a watch you already had in your watch box. I wanted it to be distinctive and different, something that you could have in addition to those watches, not instead of. I never wanted to try to compete with the other brands. Rather, I wanted to create something different. And the idea was to create a watch case that was hand machined and made more locally, and to incorporate dials and dial materials that you didn't traditionally see at that time in the watch industry. So when I first set out to produce the watch case, there were a lot of unknowns. And so there was a lot of prototyping. Firstly, we didn't really know all the specifics. When you put a crystal into the bezel, how much space do you need to leave for the eye gasket? Or when you're using case clamps, what angle should the holes for the case clamps be? How wide should they be? How much of a margin of error is reasonable to still preserve water tightness on a case back? How do you figure out how to design and produce something that hasn't been designed and produced ever before? So we started out by inputting the design into the computer. We focused on doing every single measurement. And as we began to prototype, we continually revised. So for manufacturing the case, I found an aeronautical manufacturer that was willing to work with me. And the interesting thing about this whole process is that I'm 15, 16. So I'm going into all these different meetings with all these different manufacturers. And for a large segment of my experience, both in the watch industry and in business, I've always sort of hid my age because sharing the fact that they were dealing with a high schooler or a college kid often made people look at me differently. And so it was easier for me not to say that and just to dress up, behave in a professional manner, and conduct my business and move on. The interesting and funny thing about it is that my first segment of business meetings, I was being driven to by my dad, and he would wait in the car for most of them so that I could proceed to the next step. So as we started to make these connections and we started to do these different designs, we very quickly realized how much information we didn't know. And that involved a lot of manufacturing. And so the aeronautical manufacturer that I had partnered with to do the cases, we quickly learned together that each part needed a whole new concept of thinking just to produce. Because our design was so different than a traditional watch, a lot of the traditional tools and machining didn't suit our needs. So while we were able to do some with hand machining on lathes, we were able to do some with wire EDM, some with drop EDM, and some with CNC, a lot of the machinery didn't give us the details that we needed to create the shapes and the compound curves and shapes that I had designed. One of those examples was with the lugs. I designed a cutout hidden lug pattern where the strap actually fits under the case. And the problem was I was very clear that I didn't want the hole to be drilled all the way through the case for the spring bar. Well, unfortunately, the only tool they had at their disposal at that point forced us to drill all the way through. And so we sat down and we started chatting, and they said, we can't do what you want. And I said, well, I really want to do it. How do we do it? And the conversations went a little something like this. I'd say, I need to do this. And they'd say, you can't. And then I'd say, well, what if you had to? And they'd look back at me and said, well, if we had to, we could design this and we could switch that, we could spin that. And all of a sudden we were designing tools. So we designed a tool that would go in between our lug formation and drill sideways and then come back out and then drop back down. And each step of the process required us to design different parts or different tools and rethink how we were working. I think we designed about 15 tools to produce the original Rubin Douglas case. It was a really interesting process, and because we hit so much adversity throughout the entire process, I learned so much. I got a crash course in watchmaking, I got a crash course in leathers, I got a crash course in watch boxes, in production, in movements, in design, and all of these things enabled me to continue moving forward. And the more adversity we faced, I just kept moving. You just one step in front of the other, and all of a sudden you look back a few months later and you realize you moved forward, you figure something out. A part wouldn't come out right and it would be devastating. It was devastating that all of a sudden something you'd spent months working on just didn't work at all. So we continued to prototype and produce, and as we narrowed down and produced an actual producible watch case, I was also focusing on the brand. So how do we make this into a watch brand? What does the dial look like? What does the finished watch actually mean? So I didn't want to just put a standard dial into our watch cases, especially after spending so much time on the case design. So I wanted each dial to be as distinctive as the case. My thought process was that if I partnered with local artisans, we could create and incorporate materials into the watches that you didn't traditionally see in watchmaking in 2003, 2004. And so I started partnering with these different artists to do different interesting engravings or mokume or just different materials, carbon fiber, materials you didn't traditionally see yet in that time period. There's a lot more interesting mechanical and material exploration that you see today, but there really wasn't as much at that point in watchmaking. You just didn't see as much of it. So we did all of these interesting and different designs, and the concept was that each special design would be limited to a series of 25. We also wanted each watch to be distinctive. I wanted each element to feel just as unique as the case and the dial. So we decided that each watch would come wrapped in an original Orbita watch winder. And we decided that each watch would have its own hand-stitched alligator strap. And the idea was that all of the elements would feel as unique and overdone as our unique case design. And as we were doing and finalizing the case design, each element was so important. So for instance, I wanted to make sure that the crystal, the curvature of the crystal, perfectly matched the curvature of the case. I wanted those little elements so that when you looked at the watch on your wrist, when you looked at how it felt, how it was an experience to wear, it would be something different, and you could know that each curve and each little element of the cutout and of the design was very intentional, and that was very important to me. I continued focusing on building the Rubin Douglas brand throughout high school and college, and then when I got out of college, we came up with the idea of producing a lesser priced line that incorporated some of the prototyping and some of the interesting elements that we had done with our dials in our Rubin Douglas brand into a more approachable, lower price point. And that's how the Vineyard Time line started. So that Vineyard Time brand was the second watch brand we created, and I will talk more about that in our next video. Feel free to post any comments below. Let me know if you have any questions, and please hit the subscribe button. Really appreciate all your help and all your support. Thanks so much.